I was just seconds away from turning the key in my ignition when a ragged man appeared from behind a pillar, his eyes wide with urgency. "Sir, don't start the car. Your daughter-in-law. She's trying to change everything." His voice was desperate, like he knew something that could collapse my entire world. In that instant, my heart stilled. What could Alyssa possibly have to do with this? Why would a complete stranger, homeless, from the looks of it, know anything about my family, let alone my late wife's estate? That Tuesday morning had started like any other, but it would mark the moment my life veered into betrayal, deception, and an inheritance war I never saw coming. But before we continue, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the rest of this unbelievable true story, and let us know in the comments where you're listening from. We love seeing how far these stories reach. Now, I thought I had weathered every storm life could throw at me. At 66, after losing my wife Helen 3 months earlier, I was just beginning to find my footing again. But this warning from a stranger would unravel everything I thought I knew about the people closest to me. What began as a routine meeting at a law firm turned into a revelation that shook the very foundation of my family. If you've ever trusted someone so deeply only to find out they were hiding something unthinkable, then you'll understand why I had no choice but to follow this story to the end. The morning had started off like any other quiet, steady familiar. I made my usual coffee, black, no sugar, and stood for a moment by the window watching the sun stretch over the rooftops. Helen used to hum while making breakfast, a small habit I missed more than I could admit. It had been just over 90 days since she passed, and although the grief hadn't lessened, I had grown used to carrying it. That morning I put on the navy sport coat she gave me for my 65th birthday. A classic cut, she always said, made me look distinguished. I even reached for the cufflinks she'd bought me on our 30th anniversary. The weight of them on my wrists was a quiet reassurance. The phone call had come right at 9 a.m., crisp and clinical. "Mr. Whitmore, we're ready to proceed with the estate settlement. Can you be here at 2? The woman asked, as if she were confirming a dentist appointment. I said yes, of course. After months of paperwork, I was eager to close that chapter and finally begin whatever came next. The drive downtown was slower than usual. Traffic clung to the freeway like fog, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly. I didn't know why I was nervous. It was supposed to be straightforward. Helen and I had gone over her will multiple times. Everything was to go to me, with clear provisions for our son Michael and his wife Alyssa after my passing. No drama, no confusion, just a plan made with love. But as I pulled into the parking garage beneath the law offices, a strange tension settled over me like a second skin. The concrete felt colder than it should have. I turned off the ignition, gathered the manila folder with the documents I had been asked to bring, and stepped out of the car. That's when I heard it. "Sir Mr. Whitmore, wait!" The voice came from behind one of the concrete pillars, shaky but urgent. I turned, startled, and saw a man in his early 50s approaching. His clothes were worn, the soles of his boots scuffed down to the fabric, and his gray-streaked beard was several days past shaved. He kept a respectful distance. "Please don't be alarmed," he said. "My name's Eddie Kowalski. I used to work upstairs Morrison and Associates." I eyed him warily, one hand hovering near my phone. He noticed and nodded as if he expected it. "I know this sounds crazy, sir, but I need to tell you something. About your wife's estate. About your daughter-in-law." My chest tightened. "Alyssa?" He nodded gravely, glancing around the garage as if someone might be listening. "I was a paralegal at Morrison and Associates for 12 years before they let me go last month. Before they did, I overheard things I shouldn't have. I think your daughter-in-law is trying to alter the terms of the will. She's been telling the firm you're not mentally capable of handling the estate, that you've been forgetful, confused. She has documents, fake ones, medical records, even statements saying you're not fit to manage the inheritance." I stared at him, stunned. "That's a lie," I said quietly, the words barely forming in my mouth. "I'm in perfect health," Eddie's voice softened. "I know. That's why I've been waiting here, hoping to catch you before the meeting. She wasn't expecting you to show. Told the attorneys you probably forgot the appointment." I felt the blood rush from my head. I gripped the side of the car for balance. Alyssa, my daughter-in-law of nearly a decade, the woman who hugged me on holidays, who laughed at my corny jokes, who sat beside Helen during chemotherapy treatments, was plotting behind my back. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Eddie looked me straight in the eyes. Because your wife was kind to me. Every time she came in, she said hello. She remembered my name. She treated me like a person. I can't just watch this happen. It's not right. There was no drama in his voice, no theatrics, just quiet conviction. For a man who had lost so much, he had managed to keep something precious, his conscience. And in that moment I realized this stranger might be the only person standing between me and a betrayal I hadn't even seen coming. I wanted to tell myself he was lying, that he was mistaken, confused, or maybe even unstable. But there was something about the way Eddie spoke, measured, steady, and painfully sincere, that cut through the denial forming in my mind. He wasn't asking for anything. He didn't want money. He didn't seem interested in drama. He simply needed me to know the truth. They're expecting you to sign today, he added, lowering his voice. They'll present you with revised documents ones Alyssa helped prepare. If you sign without reading carefully, you could be handing over control of the entire estate. I think that's what she's counting on. I stood there for a moment, unable to move, the hum of traffic above us on the street level sounding distant and hollow. Alyssa, sweet, smiling, Alyssa. She had always been polite, gracious, even affectionate. But as I let my mind drift backward, I began to see the signs I had ignored. The way she always interrupted me when I spoke about Helen's finances. The way she discouraged Michael from asking me about my plans. The subtle digs disguised as concern. Dad, are you sure you remembered your medication? Or, that's not what you said last week. Maybe you're mixing things up. Little comments that had once seemed harmless. Now they echoed like alarms I had chosen to sleep through. Do you have proof? I asked Eddie. He nodded. Not everything, but enough. I made copies of some documents before they let me go. The rest, well, I know where the originals are. But I had to be careful. They're watching everything. And listen, Mr. Whitmore Morrison's firm has done this before. They've worked with other clients to adjust wills in the final weeks, especially when there's money involved. They take a cut for their services, and no one ever questions it because most families don't want to make waves. My hands were cold. And Alyssa's paying them? He nodded again, slowly. Through side accounts. I saw some of the transfers. They've been helping her prepare a legal framework that would let Michael act as your trustee, meaning he'd control everything. You'd get a stipend. Maybe 35 grand a year if you're lucky. The rest? It's all going to pay off their debts. I think they're over 200,000 deep. My stomach turned. Helen and I had lived simply but comfortably. We'd saved, invested, made smart choices. She had grown up with nothing, and swore our son would never have to know that kind of insecurity. She worked 2 jobs during Michael's early years while I built my own small consulting firm. Every penny we saved was a step toward the future we hoped to leave behind. That future was now being gutted behind my back. I need to go, I said finally. I have to face them. Eddie stepped back. Just be careful. They're going to smile, act friendly, and hope you don't ask too many questions. But don't sign anything without reading every word. And if you need me, I'll be around. I won't let them get away with this. I nodded, my chest tight, then turned toward the elevator. As the doors slid open, I caught one last glimpse of Eddie retreating into the shadows between parked cars, like a man who knew too much for his own safety. The ride to the 15th floor felt like a slow crawl into enemy territory. The law office lobby gleamed with polished wood and modern art, but all I could see were illusions, smoke and mirrors. At the front desk, the receptionist offered a flawless smile. Mr. Whitmore, they're ready for you in conference room A. Of course they were. As I walked the hallway, each click of my shoes against the marble floor sounded like a countdown. I reached the door. Through the frosted glass, I could see 4 figures seated at the long mahogany table. One of them was Alyssa. Her frame was petite, her posture flawless as always. I took a breath and stepped inside. Thomas, she said sweetly, standing up. We weren't sure if you were coming today. I studied her face. There was something in her smile, a tremor, a hesitation. She hadn't expected me. Eddie was right. Of course I'm here, I replied evenly. This meeting is about my wife's estate. I wouldn't miss it. The lead attorney, an older man with silver hair and the kind of suit that screamed billable hours, gestured toward an empty chair. "Mr. Whitmore, please have a seat. We have a few documents we'll need you to review and sign today. Standard procedure." As I sat down, I noticed Alyssa twisting her wedding ring, avoiding my gaze. Something in her demeanor had shifted. She was nervous. Good. That meant she knew I wasn't walking in blind. "Before we begin," I said, placing my folder on the table, "I'd like to be walked through every change to Helen's will. My wife and I discussed everything extensively. I'm familiar with her intentions." There was a pause just long enough to confirm everything Eddie had warned me about, and in that pause, the air in the room turned sharp. I wasn't the confused old man they expected. I was Helen's husband. I was the executor of her memory, and I had just declared war. The silence that followed was telling. I watched as the attorneys glanced at each other, subtle but unmistakable, a flicker of unease behind polished smiles. Alyssa's hand had stilled on her ring, but she still wouldn't meet my eyes. The lead attorney, Morrison, cleared his throat. "Mr. Whitmore, as you may be aware, your wife made certain amendments to her will during her final weeks. These changes were filed with our office and are reflected in the documents before you." I didn't flinch. "What kind of amendments?" I asked, letting the words sit there. Alyssa leaned forward, voice soft, coated with false concern. "Thomas," Helen was worried. "You've been through so much. There were moments when you seemed distracted, forgetful. She just wanted to make sure you were protected." "Protected?" I repeated, my tone even. "Or controlled?" She blinked, caught off guard. Morrison interjected quickly. "These provisions place the estate into a managed trust, with your son Michael as trustee. You would receive a generous annual disbursement for living expenses, with the remainder managed for long-term stability." I opened the folder they'd pushed toward me. Inside were documents I had never seen. Stamped, notarized, detailed. Attached were fabricated statements, handwritten notes supposedly from friends and family, all insinuating that my mental acuity had declined. I flipped through them slowly, until one page caught my eye. A personal statement from Alyssa, dated 6 weeks ago, describing an alleged incident where I'd forgotten how to pay for groceries and accused Michael of trying to steal from me. I looked up. "This is a lie." Alyssa pressed a hand to her chest. "Thomas, you don't remember? It was so upsetting, we didn't want to embarrass you." Her performance was impressive, but I saw right through it. "Don't patronize me," I said, my voice low. "You've been playing this part for months, haven't you? Whispering to Michael, spinning your little stories, preparing for this moment." Morrison stiffened. "Mr. Whitmore, we're simply following the documentation your wife left behind." "Documentation you were paid to forge," came a voice from the doorway. Every head in the room snapped toward the source. Standing there, cleaner than when I saw him last, but still out of place amid the luxury, was Eddie Kowalski. He held a manila folder in one hand, calm and resolute. "Mr. Morrison," he nodded. "Sorry to interrupt, but this man deserves the truth." "You're trespassing," Morrison barked, already rising. "Security has been notified." "Good," Eddie replied. "Maybe they can escort you out too after the police are done reading these." He stepped forward and laid the folder on the table. Original documents. Helen Whitmore's actual will, signed 6 months ago. Complete medical records from her doctor, not the edited ones you submitted. And emails between this office and Alyssa Whitmore outlining a plan to challenge Mr. Whitmore's competency and transfer control of the estate. Alyssa let out a strangled sound, then collapsed back into her chair, face drained of all color. I opened the folder. There it was, Helen's real signature, unaltered. Her original will, exactly as she and I had discussed 100 times. No amendments, no trusts. Everything to me, clean and simple. For a moment, all I could do was stare at her name. The pain of her absence returned like a wave, but this time there was clarity, too. She had trusted me. Completely. Morrison tried to recover. "This is outrageous. These documents could be fabricated. This man is a disgruntled former employee. Who made backup copies of everything before you erased them from the system?" Eddie said evenly. "And who kept records of your private billing ledgers, including a $47,000 consultation payment from Alyssa Whitmore paid through a shell account?" Morrison opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Alyssa was trembling now, her hands shaking as she tried to gather the papers in front of her. "Why?" I asked her. The question was almost a whisper. "Why would you do this?" Her lips moved, but no sound emerged. Finally, she said, "We were drowning. Michael's business. It's gone. The house is mortgaged twice over. We owe on everything. Credit cards, back taxes, personal loans. We thought the estate would solve everything." "So you lied," I said. "You watched me mourn Helen, and while I was grieving, you were planning to erase her final wishes." Eddie looked at her with something between pity and disgust. "The trust would have given you $35,000 a year," he said to me. "Just enough to keep you quiet while the rest of the estate went to bail them out." I looked around the room. The elegant furniture, the polished men, the daughter-in-law I no longer recognized. Morrison had fallen silent, sweat beading at his temples. Alyssa finally looked up at me, tears forming, her voice a croak. "It wasn't supposed to hurt you. We were desperate." "So you destroyed my trust?" I said, standing slowly. "You forged a story in my wife's name and nearly took away everything she wanted me to have. Not just the money, her belief in me." Eddie placed a hand on my shoulder. "We should call the police." I nodded. "Do it." Alyssa fainted before they arrived. Finally, her mask fully cracked, but I felt no pity. The woman who collapsed at that table wasn't family anymore. She was a stranger in my house for nearly 10 years, and I was only just beginning to understand how deep her betrayal went. The police arrived within 20 minutes, though it felt like a lifetime. The conference room, once sterile and intimidating, had transformed into a theater of shame. Alyssa had regained consciousness but said nothing, her face pale, eyes unfocused. She sat slumped in her chair, her polished facade completely shattered. Morrison and his colleagues, still trying to maintain some semblance of professionalism, sat rigidly, waiting for someone to rescue them from the weight of their own wrongdoing. But rescue wasn't coming. Detective Sarah Chen was the first to enter, a woman in her late 50s, composed, sharp-eyed, and quietly authoritative. She introduced herself calmly, took stock of the room, then turned to me with a nod that somehow conveyed both sympathy and resolve. "Mr. Whitmore, we'll need to take statements from everyone. Let's start with you." As she and her team began securing evidence, I found myself recounting everything from Eddie's warning in the parking garage to the moment he walked in with Helen's original will. It was surreal, like narrating someone else's nightmare. But every word was true, every detail as clear as glass. When I finished, she turned to Eddie, who calmly handed over his copies of the forged documents, the real ones, and a small notebook filled with handwritten observations. Morrison looked like he might be sick. "Mrs. Whitmore," Detective Chen said, now facing Alyssa, "we'll need to hear your version of events, starting from the beginning." Alyssa didn't speak at first, but eventually her voice emerged small, trembling, stripped of all its usual charm. "It started 2 years ago. Michael's consulting firm began losing clients. At first we thought it was temporary, but it got worse. The debts piled up. He was too proud to tell his father, too proud to tell Thomas. I thought, if we could just get through the worst of it, we'd recover." "So your plan," the detective prompted gently, "was to take over your father-in-law's inheritance by having him declared mentally unfit?" Alyssa nodded slowly. "I thought, if it looked like Thomas needed help managing things, we could set up a trust. He'd still be taken care of. But Michael and I would have access to the estate to fix everything." "Fix," I repeated, bitterness creeping into my voice. "You were going to fix your financial disaster by stealing your mother-in-law's legacy, Helen's final act of love to me." Alyssa flinched, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I didn't think of it that way. We were just trying to survive." "You weren't surviving," Eddie said quietly. "You were strategizing, lying, planning every move, and forging legal documents," Chen added, "hiring a law firm willing to falsify medical records and witness statements." She turned back to Morrison. "And what's your excuse?" The older man tried to compose himself, but his hands betrayed him, trembling slightly as he clasped them on the table. "We were acting on information our client provided," he said stiffly. "If those documents were falsified, we were misled." "You charged 50 grand for being misled?" Eddie interjected, tone cold. Because I've got the invoice right here. The room fell silent again. Alyssa had gone still, her breathing shallow. Her hands, once always perfectly manicured, now clutched at the arms of the chair as if they were the only thing keeping her upright. Mr. Whitmore, Detective Chen said gently, you may need to come down to the station later today to provide a formal statement. But from everything I've seen here, this will likely escalate into criminal charges. Fraud, forgery, conspiracy, possibly elder financial abuse. We'll follow through on every lead. I nodded but didn't speak. I couldn't. I was staring at Alyssa again. This woman who had sat at my dinner table, who had once kissed my wife on the cheek and called her mom. Had it all been a lie? Had any of it ever been real? Why? I asked her again, barely above a whisper. Why didn't you just ask for help? Alyssa finally looked at me. Really looked at me for the first time since I'd entered the room. Her face was blotchy, her eyes raw. Because I was ashamed, she said. Because I knew Helen would have helped. You too. But that would mean admitting I'd failed. And I couldn't do that. So I found another way. You didn't just fail, Alyssa, I said. You betrayed. You calculated. You watched me mourn the woman I loved, and decided that was your moment to strike. Her mouth opened, but no words came out, and honestly there was nothing left to say. I stood slowly, the weight of everything pressing on my shoulders like stone. I looked down at the table one last time, the stack of forged documents, the blinking red light of the recording device still running in the corner, the truth laid bare for all to see. Detective, I said, if you need anything else, I'll be at home. I have a lot of thinking to do. And without looking back, I walked out of the room. The sound of Alyssa's quiet sobs followed me into the hallway, but I didn't stop. I didn't need to. For the first time in months, I finally knew what was real. Helen had trusted me, and no lie, no scheme, no betrayal could take that from me. 3 days passed before I answered Michael's calls. 17 in total. Each one rang out, vibrating on the kitchen counter like a ghost knocking on the door. I needed time not just to process the betrayal, but to steel myself for whatever truths or lies he might bring with him. I didn't know whether to expect rage, denial, or regret. Truthfully, I didn't know what version of my son I'd be speaking to anymore. But that Friday afternoon, at precisely 2 o'clock, the doorbell rang. I had known he would come. I always knew Michael wasn't one to stay silent long. When I looked through the peephole, I saw a man who barely resembled the son I'd raised. His once crisp dress shirt was wrinkled and hanging loose over his belt. His face, usually clean-shaven and confident, looked sunken and pale. And beside him stood Alyssa, visibly smaller than the woman who had tried to strip away my autonomy just days before. I opened the door but didn't step aside. "Dad?" Michael said softly. Just that one word, and it cracked something in me I didn't expect. I stepped back and motioned them inside, not out of forgiveness, but necessity. I needed to hear it all, and they needed to say it. The living room had never felt more alien. This was the room Helen and I had filled with laughter, holiday decorations, conversations that lasted until midnight. Now it felt like a courtroom. Alyssa sat stiffly at the edge of the couch, while Michael hovered behind her, unsure of where to land. I remained standing, arms folded. "Start talking," I said. Michael took a deep breath. Detective Chen told me everything about the forged documents, the false statements, the real will. I nodded, not interrupting. "Dad, I swear to you," he continued, "I didn't know. I knew we were in trouble financially, but I didn't know Alyssa was doing any of this. I thought Mom had changed the will herself. Alyssa told me Helen was worried about your memory, that she wanted to make sure you were looked after." I believed her. "So you thought your mother would undermine me behind my back?" I asked. "That she'd question my competence and never tell me?" He hesitated, and the silence was its own answer. "It didn't make sense," he admitted. "But Alyssa made it seem like it was all out of love, that we were protecting you." I turned to Alyssa then. "Did you protect me, Alyssa? Is that what you were doing?" Her voice was faint. "I was trying to protect my family. We were drowning, Thomas. Michael didn't want to ask you for help. He's too proud," I thought. "If we could just gain control of the estate, we could fix everything without burdening you." "Fixing it by stealing," I said flatly. She winced, but didn't argue. You could have come to me, I said, quieter now. Both of you. Helen would have helped in a heartbeat. I would have done the same. But instead you chose deception. You used my grief as cover. You turned Helen's death into an opportunity. It wasn't meant to be cruel, Michael said, the shame heavy in his voice. Then why does it feel that way? I asked. I looked at him long and hard. How long have you doubted me? He didn't answer. Was it when I forgot the neighbor's dog's name? When I misheard your dinner plans? When Alyssa said I left the stove, on which never happened, by the way? She told me there were patterns, he said weakly. Little things, said Mom had talked to her about it. I didn't know what to believe. But you didn't seem like yourself after she passed, Dad. You were. Off. Grief makes people off, Michael, I snapped. Losing your wife of 40 years doesn't come with a manual. And instead of supporting me, you let your wife convince you that I was slipping, that I needed to be managed. Like a burden. Alyssa wiped her face, now streaked with mascara. We were desperate. So was Eddie, I said sharply. He was living out of his car. But he didn't lie, cheat, or forge legal documents. He did the right thing. That's what desperate people with integrity do. Michael looked like he had been punched. He sank into the armchair across from me, rubbing his temples. What happens now? He asked. What do we do? I didn't answer right away. I walked to the fireplace and stared at the photograph sitting on the mantel, Helen, holding our grandson, laughing in the sunlight. That image was pure, real, untouched by all this rot. I turned back to them. First, Alyssa cooperates with the police, I said. Completely. No deals. No hiding. You face what you did. She nodded without protest. And you, Michael, you need to decide if you can stay married to someone who would manipulate you into thinking your own father had lost his mind. His eyes widened, but he didn't speak. I kept going. You don't fix betrayal with platitudes. You fix it with truth, action, and consequences. I don't know if this family can be saved, but if there's any hope left, it begins with honesty. No more excuses, no more lies. The room fell quiet again. Outside, I could hear the wind brushing through the trees in our yard. The same trees Helen and I had planted together. I realized then that something had shifted. Not closure. Not yet. But something more fragile, a line drawn in the sand. What they did with that line was up to them. And what I did with my future was finally, irrevocably, up to me. 6 months passed. The air had turned crisp with the arrival of October, and the maple tree Helen and I planted for Michael's 10th birthday stood proud in the yard, its leaves a blaze of red and gold. I watched them flutter from the porch each morning with my coffee in hand, the rhythm of their descent reminding me that time, no matter how twisted by betrayal, still moved forward. The wounds were healing, though the scars remained. Alyssa had accepted a plea deal, 2 years of probation, 400 hours of community service, and full restitution of the legal fees paid to Morrison and Associates. The lawyers weren't so lucky. Morrison was sentenced to 3.5 years in federal prison. His 2 junior partners received 18 months each. Eddie's testimony had been instrumental. His notebook, his quiet determination, and his refusal to be bought or silenced had turned the tide. He had done what people far more powerful and privileged had refused to do. He told the truth when it mattered most. And I hadn't forgotten. I offered Eddie the apartment above the workshop behind my house, a small space Helen had once used as an art studio. He accepted, on the condition he could earn his keep. Now he tended the garden, helped with repairs, and even joined me for Sunday breakfasts on the porch. His presence was steady, unassuming, a quiet reminder that decency doesn't wear a suit. Michael moved out of the house he once shared with Alyssa 3 weeks after our conversation in the living room. He now rented a modest apartment downtown, a far cry from the 5-bedroom home in Maple Ridge they had once flaunted, but it suited him. Stripped of distractions, he was beginning to rediscover himself. He'd lost weight, aged in ways only pain can age a man, but there was a new kind of strength in his eyes, one forged from hard lessons and self-reflection. I keep second-guessing everything, he confessed to me once over coffee. Every decision, every conversation. I don't know how much of what I thought was mine. My thoughts, my choices were actually hers. I understood more than he realized. I too had spent sleepless nights replaying every interaction, every glance Alyssa gave me, every time I brushed off a concern or dismissed an instinct. The deception had been gradual, skillful. That was the danger of manipulation. It didn't scream. It whispered. The divorce proceedings were nearly finalized. Through them, Michael discovered credit cards opened in his name without his knowledge, loans taken out against his business, and lavish spending that Alyssa had hidden for years. Their financial collapse hadn't just been about market downturns or bad luck. It had been carefully buried beneath secrets and delusion. I offered to help financially, emotionally, but Michael refused. "I need to fix this myself," he said. "If I don't, I'll always wonder if I learned anything at all." And so he rebuilt from the ground up. He sold the luxury car, picked up side contracts, and worked 16-hour days to salvage what was left of his reputation. Last week, he showed me a photograph of a small office space he had just leased. Painted on the window were the words, "Whitmore Consulting." "Built the right way this time," he said. I had never been prouder of him. Not for the office, but for the man he was becoming, the one I had raised him to be. As for Alyssa, she had been assigned to work at a local food bank for her community service. Ironically, it was the same food bank where Eddie now helped organize donation pickups for the local church. When I asked him once what it was like seeing her there, he just shrugged. "She shows up, works hard, doesn't complain. That's more than I expected. I hadn't seen her since the day in my living room. I didn't plan to, but I let go of the anger, not for her, but for me. Carrying it had grown heavy. Forgiveness was still a distant country, but I was learning to live without resentment poisoning my peace. In Helen's absence, I had feared I would be alone, but I wasn't. I found community in unexpected places. Eddie had become a friend, someone who asked how I was and actually waited for the answer. I volunteered at the local library, tutoring adults and reading a quiet tribute to Helen, who had always believed in second chances. I even helped the local police department draft an educational pamphlet for seniors on how to recognize financial exploitation. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had nearly become a statistic. Now I was helping others avoid that fate. That morning, as Eddie brought out 2 steaming mugs of coffee and sat beside me on the porch, I realized something else. I was content. Not the kind of contentment that comes from wealth or comfort, but the kind that blooms when the truth is finally aired out, when justice has had its say, and when the people who tried to take everything from you realized they could never touch your soul. I had lost Helen. I had been betrayed. But I had survived. And in surviving, I had discovered something I never expected at 66 a second beginning. That afternoon, just as the sun dipped below the tree line and cast the yard in a warm amber hue, Michael pulled into the driveway. He stepped out of his aging Honda Civic, 10 years old, and with more dents than paint at this point, but he didn't seem to care. There was something lighter in his step, a quiet steadiness that hadn't been there before. When he walked through the kitchen door, he greeted me with a smile that felt honest, not rehearsed, not weighted with guilt. I poured us both a cup of coffee, and we sat at the kitchen table, same spot he'd eaten breakfast at every school day for 18 years. "You look good," I said, watching him closely. "I feel good," he replied. "For the first time in a long time, I'm not pretending anymore. I'm not fixing someone else's mess. I'm just living." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper, smoothing it on the table between us. A printed photo, his new office, modest but real, with freshly painted walls and a single potted plant by the door. "I signed the lease 2 days ago," he said, pride softening his voice. "It's mine, every bit of it." I studied the photo. Simple, clean, unpretentious, like Helen would have loved. "She'd be proud of you," I said. "Your mother. She always believed you'd figure things out. Even when you didn't." He chuckled lightly, his eyes misting over. "I think about her all the time now, about what she'd say if she saw how far I fell." "She'd remind you that falling isn't failure," I said. "Staying down is. And you didn't stay down." He nodded, then went quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup slowly in his hands. "Dad," he said, voice suddenly tight, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Completely honest." I met his gaze. "Always. Can you ever forgive me?" The question hung in the air like a breath waiting to be exhaled. I didn't answer right away. Forgiveness, real forgiveness, isn't just a word you toss out like spare change. It's a choice, a daily one. It's waking up each morning and deciding that the weight someone put on your shoulders doesn't get to stay there forever. Michael, I said slowly, forgiveness doesn't happen in a single moment. It's something I choose every day, little by little. Some days it's easier, some days it's not. But yes, I've forgiven you, because I know you were lied to, manipulated, because I can see the man sitting in front of me is not the same man who sat silent while his wife tried to erase my life. And that matters. His eyes filled and he lowered his head. I should have known better. I should have trusted you more than I trusted her. You should have, I said. But you didn't. And we can't change that now. What we can do is rebuild. One conversation at a time. We sat in silence for a few minutes, just letting the words settle between us. Outside, the wind rustled through the leaves. A squirrel darted across the fence line, and Eddie's laughter echoed faintly from the back garden, where he was trimming the rose bushes Helen planted years ago. What about Alyssa? Michael asked eventually, his voice cautious. Do you think you'll ever be able to forgive her? I leaned back in my chair, let the question sit like a stone in a still pond. I don't know, I said truthfully. She didn't just make a mistake. She built a campaign. She spent months collecting lies, twisting kindness into weapons. What she did was calculated. It was cruel. She says she's changed. Maybe she has, I said. People can change. But forgiveness isn't about whether someone's changed. It's about whether I'm willing to carry the weight of resentment. And I've decided not to. I've put the anger down. That doesn't mean I trust her. And it doesn't mean she has a place in my life. But I refuse to let her steal anything else, not even my peace. Michael nodded, slowly, thoughtfully. I think I understand. And I believed he did. As he stood to leave, I walked him to the door. The sky was painted in deep orange now, streaked with violet clouds. The kind of sunset Helen used to stop mid-sentence to admire. Michael turned at the porch step and looked at me for a long moment. Thank you, he said, for not giving up on me. I placed a hand on his shoulder. Thank you for finding your way back. After he left, I stood alone in the yard for a while, watching the last of the light disappear. And for the first time in years, I felt something I thought I'd lost for good, quiet, steady, unshakable peace. Later that evening, I walked through the house Helen and I built together, the place where every wall whispered a memory. The living room still held the warmth of family holidays and late-night conversations. The kitchen still smelled faintly of cinnamon from her favorite tea, even after all these months. But it no longer felt like a monument to loss. It felt alive again. Not because time had erased the grief, but because truth had carved space for healing. For weeks, I'd been piecing myself back together in quiet ways. I started volunteering at the local library on Tuesdays and Thursdays, tutoring adults who had never learned to read. Helen used to say that literacy was the greatest key to dignity, and it felt right to carry that torch for her. I also helped Eddie set up a community garden behind the workshop. What began as a small patch of tomatoes and basil had grown into rows of carrots, spinach, and even a few blackberry bushes. We donated what we didn't eat to the food pantry where, as irony would have it, Alyssa still served out her community service. Eddie said she worked hard, never complained, never tried to explain herself either. I hadn't seen her up close since that day in my living room. I didn't want to. I didn't need to. Let the courts handle justice. Let life handle the rest. What mattered to me now was the integrity of the life I was rebuilding on my terms, with the people who had proven worthy of being part of it. One afternoon, Eddie came up from the garden, carrying a crate of vegetables and 2 coffees. Saw your son at the co-op this morning, he said, setting the crate on the porch. He looked good, really good, like he's finally sleeping again. I smiled. He is. He told me the other day he started running. Says the early mornings help clear his head. Funny how doing the right thing clears more than just your conscience, Eddie said, sitting down beside me. He mentioned you might come by the food bank soon, I nodded slowly. I've thought about it, not for Alyssa, just to help. I've got time. And too much time in isolation turns a man into his own worst echo chamber. Eddie grinned. Well, they'd be lucky to have you. There was a long, companionable silence between us. I never would have guessed that a disheveled man in a parking garage would become one of the truest people I'd ever known. But Eddie never flinched, not in court, not under pressure, and certainly not in the face of injustice. He could have walked away, stayed silent, Instead, he risked everything to bring the truth to light. I'd offered to pay him. He refused. I didn't do it for money, he said. I did it because it was right. That kind of man is rare. So I made sure he'd never be without a roof over his head or a friend in the world. A few weeks later, Michael showed up again, this time with a surprise. "You busy?" he asked, stepping out of the car with a big grin and something hidden behind his back. "Not unless you count deadheading roses," I replied. He walked toward me, holding a framed photograph. "Found this in storage," he said, handing it to me. It was a photo of Helen in the garden, sun hat on, dirt on her cheeks, holding a basket of fresh vegetables with the brightest smile I'd ever seen. My throat tightened. "I thought it belonged here," he said. "Where she's still growing something." I nodded, unable to speak for a moment. We hung it in the hallway, right where the morning light would catch it. That day, after he left, I stood in front of that photo for a long time, not with sadness, but with a strange, grateful ache. Everything she built, her marriage, her family, her legacy, had been tested, nearly stolen. But in the end, it endured, because character isn't buried in bank accounts or wrapped up in legal documents. It lives in the choices people make when no one's watching. And that's what I had learned most through all of this. Alyssa thought she could manipulate her way to security. Morrison thought his money made him untouchable. But both of them had failed to understand something simple. Truth always shows its face, eventually. You can bury it, delay it, rewrite it, but you can't outrun it forever. And when it comes, it brings clarity, justice, and sometimes, if you're lucky, peace. As I sat on the porch that evening with Helen's photo on the hallway wall, Eddie tending the tomatoes behind the house, and my son slowly reclaiming the man he was meant to be, I realized something I never thought I'd say. I was happy. Not in the naive, everything's perfect kind of way, but in the quiet, weathered, I survived kind of way. I had my integrity. I had the truth. And I had earned this peace one hard lesson at a time. 2 weeks later, on a quiet Saturday morning, I found myself standing in front of the food bank. Not out of curiosity about Alyssa, and certainly not because I had anything left to say to her, but because I needed to be useful. I needed to serve something bigger than my past. The place bustled with volunteers loading boxes, sorting donations, and chatting over steaming cups of bad coffee. I signed in with a volunteer coordinator named Lorraine, a silver-haired dynamo who looked like she'd been organizing communities since before I was born. "You're Thomas Whitmore?" she asked with a grin. "We've heard about you. Eddie said you might stop by." She led me to the back, where I started breaking down shipping boxes and restocking shelves. It was quiet work, repetitive, honest, just the kind of rhythm my hands and heart needed. An hour later, I spotted Alyssa across the room. She was wiping down tables in the kitchen, hair tied back, sleeves rolled up. There was no makeup, no performance, just a woman doing her court-ordered penance one meal at a time. She didn't notice me at first, and when she finally did, she froze mid-step. Her body went stiff, her eyes wide, as if unsure whether to run or apologize. I gave her a nod, nothing more, and turned back to my task. That was all there was to say, and to my surprise, she simply nodded back, then returned to wiping the counter. No words, no theatrics, just quiet acknowledgement. It was enough. I wasn't there to rub salt in the wound, nor to reopen any chapters I had already closed. Forgiveness doesn't always look like reconciliation. Sometimes, it just means no longer needing to be angry. Over the next few weeks, I kept returning. Tuesdays, Fridays, sometimes Sundays. I sorted canned goods, swept floors, and handed out produce to families who reminded me that everyone, no matter how put together they looked, carries something heavy. It was there, in that humble warehouse full of cardboard boxes and dented cans, that I remembered what dignity looked like. Not status, not wealth. Dignity. That quiet pride of earning your keep, of serving others, of showing up when no one's watching. It reminded me of Helen. Always serving, never boasting. She would have loved it here. In fact, I began to see her in the smallest things, the way one volunteer folded aprons the same way she folded tea towels, or how a young girl in line clutched a worn book the way Helen used to cradle her favorite gardening almanac. And just like that, she didn't feel so far away. One afternoon, Eddie joined me as I locked up the side gate. "You ever think about how close you came to signing that will?" he asked. I nodded. "Every day, and how different life would have looked right now." I didn't answer. We both knew. I would have been living on an allowance, watching my late wife's wishes twisted into a mockery, thinking she had doubted me in her final days. That thought had haunted me more than the money ever could. "I've seen a lot of families get destroyed by greed," Eddie continued, "but I've never seen one claw its way back like yours." "We're still clawing," I said, still learning how to speak truth without tearing open old wounds. He gave me a knowing look. "You ever think about letting go of the rest of it? The last little pieces?" "What pieces?" I asked. "The ones that still keep you up at night." I didn't answer right away. We walked in silence to the back lot, where the late sunlight bathed everything in golden warmth. I thought about the weight I still carried. Not the heavy kind that broke your back, but the subtle kind that settles in your bones. Regret, anger, that voice that says, "How didn't I see it coming?" "Maybe someday," I said finally. "I'm not there yet, but I'm working on it." Eddie nodded, as if that was the best answer a man could give. That evening, I returned home to a quiet house. Michael had called earlier to say he was busy preparing for a business pitch, his third this month. The consulting work was growing. Clients were coming back, slowly but steadily. He was beginning to find his footing again. And it was his footing this time. Not Alyssa's, not mine. His. I sat on the porch and opened the mail. Among the usual bills and flyers, there was a handwritten note. It was from Alyssa. Just a few short lines. "Thomas, I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted to thank you for your silence, for your dignity. I see now how much I took for granted, not just money, but trust, kindness, and the quiet strength of the people I thought I was smarter than. I'm trying to be better. That's all I can say. Alyssa." I folded the note and placed it back in the envelope. I didn't know what to feel. Gratitude? Closure? Nothing at all? But I didn't tear it up. I didn't burn it. I tucked it into Helen's old recipe box, the one she kept her clippings and handwritten notes in. Not because I needed to keep it, but because I needed to file it somewhere out of sight, out of heart, but not forgotten. Some things don't get resolved, they get remembered. And then, eventually, they stop hurting. That night, I slept through until morning. First time in months. By the time winter rolled in and the first frost settled on the garden beds out back, I realized just how much had changed, not just in my circumstances, but in me. The anger that once pulsed beneath my skin had quieted. The grief, once raw and paralyzing, had softened into something gentler like an old photograph, faded but comforting. Life hadn't returned to the way it was before Helen passed. It never could. But something better had emerged in its place. A life that was honest, intentional, earned. The kind of life you don't stumble into, you build it, brick by brick, decision by decision. One morning in early December, Michael stopped by with 2 cups of coffee and a box of pastries. His face was less worn these days, his eyes clearer. The lines around his mouth still hinted at guilt, but he no longer walked like a man dragging chains behind him. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one he'd scribbled spelling words on as a boy, and talked about everything and nothing work. The weather, whether the garden would survive the frost. Then, after a lull, he asked, "Do you ever think about what it would have been like if things had gone differently?" I didn't need to ask what he meant. "Sometimes," I said, "but not the way you think. I don't sit around imagining what I'd say if I could go back and stop Alyssa sooner. I think about what it would have cost me if Eddie hadn't stepped in. If I'd signed those papers. If I'd spent the rest of my life believing Helen had lost faith in me." I took a long sip of coffee. That kind of damage doesn't heal. It rewrites you. Michael nodded slowly. "I still don't know how I didn't see it. I look back now and everything is so obvious. Obvious in hindsight," I said. "But in real time, when you're scared and broke and someone you love is telling you everything will be okay, if you just look the other way, it's not so easy. You were manipulated, son. That doesn't make you weak. It makes you human." He looked up at me then. "Do you think I'll ever stop feeling like I failed you?" I considered the question. "No," I said honestly. "But I think you'll learn to live with it, and maybe that feeling is what will keep you honest the next time you're standing on a ledge." A quiet laugh escaped him. You always did know how to make things land hard. I'm your father, I said with a small smile. It's in the job description. Later, after he left, I walked through the house again. Not out of habit, but because I liked the way the late sun filtered through the curtains and painted the walls gold. I paused at the photo of Helen we'd hung in the hallway, her smile still luminous, even behind glass. I touched the frame lightly, not with sadness, but gratitude. She had left me everything I needed, not in money or possessions, but in the strength to know right from wrong, to choose principle over comfort, to protect the truth when it was under threat. The legacy she left wasn't in the will, it was in the life we built together, a life of decency, a life that demanded more from people, a life that didn't bend for convenience. That legacy had almost been lost to lies and fear and debt. But it hadn't been, because when it mattered most, a stranger had stepped up. And eventually, so had my son. I stepped out onto the porch just as Eddie was returning from the hardware store with a fresh bundle of twine for the winter garden. He handed me a pair of gloves. "You ready to wrap the tomato cages?" he asked. I nodded. "Let's do it before the ground gets any harder." And just like that, the day continued, quiet, purposeful, good. As the sky faded into evening and the stars began to blink into place, I realized that what I had now wasn't a second chance. It was the reward of having chosen to survive with dignity. A life that had been broken wide open, and then, with the help of unexpected hands, stitched back together with truth. Not perfect, not painless, but real. And that was enough. If this story moved you even just a little, I invite you to be part of a growing community that values truth, resilience, and the quiet strength of everyday people. These aren't just stories. They're reflections of the challenges so many of us face behind closed doors: betrayal, family, forgiveness, and the fight to reclaim what's rightfully ours. And if you found yourself nodding, tearing up, or holding your breath along the way, then this channel was made for you. So if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that matters. Every week, we bring you powerful, real-life narratives that remind us what it means to endure, to heal, and to rise no matter the odds. And we're just getting started. Your voice matters here too. Leave a comment below and let us know where you're watching from or if you've ever experienced something similar. This isn't just about listening, it's about connecting, sharing, learning from each other. And if you believe stories like this should reach more people, people who might be struggling in silence, go ahead and like the video and share it with someone you care about. You never know who might need to hear it today. Thank you for watching, thank you for feeling, and above all, thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next story. Until then, take care of yourself and keep holding on to the truth.